This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel. We are Echoes of War, joined here by my co-host, Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Greg, wonderful to be back here and looking forward to our upcoming video.
Yeah, it's going to be the last episode in this ongoing series about the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. But before we jump into it, I just want to mention to the audience, if you'd like to further support the channel, please consider checking out the YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And the latest exclusive episode was actually based off of one guy's recommendation. It was a logistical look at the Guadalcanal campaign. So it's pretty interesting. The entire episode goes through the entire campaign, but taking the perspective of the logistics over the actual military actions. It's a little bit nerdy, but I think a lot of people will enjoy it.
Especially considering the start of the campaign when the Marines were practically left stranded without a lot of their food and equipment. And especially, I think a lot of the few tanks and heavy guns had not yet even been loaded
Yeah, of
on the
course.
beaches.
And again, as we keep saying to everybody, please consider checking us out on our YouTube channel, which is the Pacific War Channel, for the full episodes. But if you want to just watch clips, there is a Echoes of War clips channel. We have full visualizations. It's kind of, I'm trying to make this more or less like a documentary. So we're using portraits, clips of, like footage from maybe combat or things that were said by generals. Of course, it's a lot of maps. Specifically today, we're going to have a map of a very detailed map of Corregidor, as well as the overview of the Philippines, because we're going to be talking about some of the actions involving the smaller Philippine islands. While this episode will probably be titled The Fall of Corregidor, it's actually more of a cleanup operation across the whole Philippines archipelago. So it's actually very confusing, and I assure you, people in the West have no idea of the geography of the Philippines, so it might help if you watch us on YouTube. Yeah.
Well,
But
mopping up is never really a fun thing.
no, it is not. So actually, stating all of that, I'm going to put up my first map. And yes, this is straight out of a textbook, but I assure you it's one of the more detailed ones. We'll keep it on the northern part now, but to catch everybody up a little bit, during the first 4 months of the war, General Homa lacked the resources necessary to conduct operations on both the northern and southern Philippine islands. So obviously he was kind of hitting specific targeted areas one by one. Essentially, as long as the struggle was confined to Luzon, the islands in the south were relatively safe from invasion. However, Homa did execute limited operations to establish a foothold in Sulu by capturing Jolo, and in Mindanao by taking Davao, and landing at Zamboanga back in early March. So if we look over here on my map, I'm just going to bring it down to the southern Philippines. You can see some of the areas that we have mentioned. Davao is right down there in Mindanao. Mindanao is one of the larger of these smaller islands. I'll keep it just a little up here. We're going to be talking about a lot of these places. Now, following the fall of Bataan, which we covered in the last episode, Homa was now free to begin operations on the southern islands to gradually complete the conquest of the Philippines, which honestly is a very secondary thing. Remember, the whole reason for this campaign was basically to neutralize the Philippines so that they can carry over and do what they had to do in the Dutch East Indies, something that was a lot more crucial to the overall mission. Now he was going to be bringing with him...
ultimately the primary objective, and Homa has already lost a lot of face with the Army High Command.
Yeah, exactly. He's brought with him two battle-hardened detachments, the Kawaguchi detachment from Borneo and the Kawamura detachment from Malaya. So the Kawaguchi detachment was set to engage in Cebu. I just want to make sure I have that on my map. Cebu is... Oh my god, is it not
in the
marked?
Middle? Just scroll down a little bit.
Yeah, there it is, right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just
Sorry,
add,
people?
for some reason,
Yeah.
the Kawaguchi detachments, because sort of like my favorite detachment of the various Japanese detachment names.
Well, we
But
know
probably
what's going to
because
happen to them.
But probably it's because my bias of going through a lot of the Guadalcanal campaign as well, so where they play
course.
a role there. So
Yeah, no, they have an extensive history. They're one of the more famous. There's of course other detachments we could talk about, but yeah, they're very, very famous. So they're going to be engaging in Cebu, while the Kawamura detachment, was going to be targeting Panay. Both islands were part of the Visayan Islands group, lying between Mindanao and Luzon. The plan was pretty straightforward. They're going to seize these islands before moving on to the larger Mindanao island. Now, Brigadier General William Sharp was commanding the Visayan Mindanao force, and he established his HQ in Cebu. His force was almost entirely comprised of Philippine army troops, totaling around 3 divisions, as well as some provisional and constable like units. Sharp faced the same issues as those in Luzon. His men were untrained, outnumbered, and they severely lacked equipment. They had very few blankets, mosquito bars, and every man was armed with basically a 9-field rifle, many of which were quite defective and broken down, but they were available. They had some .30 and .50 caliber machine guns, but many were inoperable and they had to be discarded. The lack of spare parts meant that most weapons needing repair, they're not going to be able to do so. They had no anti-tank guns. They didn't really have much grenades. They had no gas masks. They didn't have steel helmets. Their ammunition supply was also critically low. The most significant issue was a severe shortage of artillery. They didn't even have enough uniforms for all the soldiers. Sharp's original mission was to defend the entire area south of Luzon, but this was clearly unfeasible. General MacArthur then ordered him to concentrate on defending Mindanao and its strategic airfield at Del Monte. Should the defense collapse, he was going to establish guerrilla groups in the island's interior. Now, Brigadier General Bradford Chenoweth was Sharp's counterpart in the Visayas. Chenoweth commanded about 20,000 men. 7,000 were in Pinay under Colonel Albert Christie, 6,500 in Cebu under Colonel Irving Scudder, 3,000 were in Negros under Colonel Roger Hillsman, 2,500 were in Leyte and Samar under Colonel Theodore Cornell, and about 1,000 men in Bohol under Lieutenant General Arthur Grims. And for about a month, Chenoweth oversaw the construction of airfields, tank obstacles, trenches, and gun emplacements, while stringing wire and preparing demolitions on Panay and Cebu. He initiated a program called Operation Baos Au, Get It Back, a large-scale movement of supplies into the island's interior for future guerrilla warfare. So they were creating like secret caches where they would establish, in places that were quite remote and inaccessible. This program made the Filipino populace feel pretty abandoned, and it was, eroding their faith in the American defense.
Understandable from their perspective. An invasion army is about to land, and your primary defenses are pulling back.
Yeah. On April the 5th, Kawaguchi reached the Lingayen Gulf, and he subsequently made his way to Cebu. By April the 9th, Chenoweth received reports of the impending invasion, and he placed all of his men on high alert. Kawaguchi's detachment, consisting of about 4,852 battle-hardened troops, sailed in 11 transports escorted by 3 cruisers. The Imperial Japanese Navy's force then split into 2 convoys, one landing at Cebu City and the other around Toledo. The capital of Cebu was defended by the Cebu Military Police Regiment. It's about 1,100 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Howard Edmonds, who would confront the bulk of the Kawaguchi detachment. Edmonds' mission was to hold out long enough to allow the demolition teams to, complete their work before retreating back into the hills. Chenoweth actually commented on this, stating, "I had no idea of being able to stop the Japs, but I thought we could spend 2 or 3 days in withdrawal." Just want to make sure on my map, I'm going to highlight, put Cebu kind of in the middle here. Yeah, let's focus a little bit on Cebu and Mindanao, because Mindanao is going to be coming up as well. Again, for those who aren't watching us on YouTube, a lot easier to follow with the maps. The battle for Cebu City lasted a single day. Kawaguchi's men were just better trained, more numerous, they're better armed. The defenders were gradually pushed back, but they managed to buy the time required to blow up the bridges, leading into the interior. By about 5 p.m., the Japanese broke off their actions on the outskirts of the city. Edmonds and his men then withdrew under the cover of darkness. The Japanese found similar success on the western side of the island at Toledo. The Philippine army mounted a vigorous defense against the enemy landing, but they were unable to stop them. And they were forced to retreat along the cross-inland highway towards the town of Catabaco, leaving Toledo in Japanese hands. At Catabaco, located just midway across the island, the highway forks into 2 branches. One leads to General Chenoweth's HQ, which was near Tilase, the other to Naga. Chenoweth understood the importance of Catabaco to the overall defense of Cebu, so he assigned men under Colonel Grimes there to ensure demolitions were conducted to impede the Japanese advance. Unfortunately, the Japanese stormed Catabaco with tanks and armored cars far too swiftly for the demolition teams to actually complete their preparations. Colonel Grimes was actually captured by a Japanese patrol while they were rushing towards Chenoweth's HQ near Tilase, Naga. Consequently, Chenoweth was compelled to disband his HQ and then flee north, as were the forces at Naga. Central Cebu would fall on the night of April the 12th, and guerrilla warfare would become the only available option for the Allies in that area. General Wainwright acknowledged the loss of Cebu and ordered General Sharp to reassume command of the remaining Visayan force on April the 16th. So things were going kind of disastrous, from the very start of this operation. Now, over
And to
on
be fair,
Panay,
that's pretty much the Allied Pacific results at the start of the Pacific War.
yeah, pretty much. And as we can see over here, Panay. Over on Panay, Colonel Christie fortified his defenses, and on April the 16th, the Kawamura detachment landed at Iloro. And I do apologize, the pronunciation of Philippine places borders on some of the Asiatic languages and Spanish languages. It's always kind of a which one do I go with? So I'm doing my best on the southwest corner of Panay, as well as at Capiz in the north. 2 days later, a third landing occurred at San Jose, and all of those landings encountered no resistance. By the 20th, General Kawamura had seized these strategic points on the island and considered his campaign a success. So he basically thought it was concluded. However, for Colonel Christie, who was to secure, the mountainous interior, where he was well stalking everything, the campaign had only just begun. Wild game was abundant there. There was ample fresh water, and there was about 500 head of cattle, 15,000 bags of rice, and hundreds of canned goods. They were very well prepared for a long guerrilla campaign. Christie dispatched units to engage in hit-and-run raids, prompting the Japanese to carry out punitive expeditions at San Jose to locate the guerrilla HQ. One of these Japanese companies fell into an ambush set up by guerrilla fighters armed only with bows, spears, and bolos, resulting in significant casualties amongst the attackers. Yeah.
Can I just say, Bad Jack Churchill would have loved to be here?
yeah, he would have loved this. I know it's not Pacific War. No, he did engage in the Pacific, didn't he, at the end? I wonder if I could ever do an episode on him. He's such a fascinating character.
An officer always has a sword.
Yeah. And one of his quotes was like, he was disappointed the war was over or something. Okay, I remember reading something about one of his later quotes.
Yeah, I read something like that. He was quite unhappy. He hoped the war would continue for much longer so that he can...
Yeah.
You're talking about a guy who was playing the bagpipe while, going on a commando raid.
Yeah. He honestly, the first thing that comes to mind, he's kind of like literally the Yaucha from Predator. He's just out there like hunting people with a bow and arrow. It's crazy. So, despite the guerrilla warfare, for practical purposes, the island was neutralized, and soon Mindanao would come under threat. Now, April proved to be quite a favorable month for General Homa, who desperately needed momentum. He had received reinforcements that were crucial in breaking the defenses of Bataan, compelling General King to surrender his forces on April the 9th. So actually, I'm going to make sure my map... Okay, I'm in the Visayan Sea. So following this achievement after the fall of Bataan, Homa launched operations against the Visayas, successfully neutralizing that region. With the Visayas secured, Homa now had a base from which to attack Mindanao. And we'll just put the map all the way down here to Mindanao. Perfect. In Mindanao, Sharp commanded 3 poorly trained and inadequately equipped Filipino divisions, with very few artillery pieces, and an additional division recently organized at Cagayan. Sharp's men faced numerous shortages. They had not enough blankets, like I said, no mosquito bars, they didn't even have enough uniforms for their men. Each soldier possessed an Enfield 17 rifle, but many had no idea how to even operate them. Additionally, many rifles were defective. They were prone to breaking, especially with, no parts being available, you couldn't repair them. They lacked grenades, they had no gas masks, they didn't have steel helms, they had no anti-tank guns, their ammunition supplies were very, very low. The most critical issue was, of course, the lack of artillery. Now, although Corregidor was vital for controlling Manila Bay, MacArthur aimed to ensure that Mindanao was secure for the future reconquest of the Philippines, making the American control over the island paramount.
Was it going to be like his future stepping stone for when he was to return?
Yeah.
At least in his world at this time.
For people who aren't watching this on YouTube, it's basically the southeasternmost island. And it's also very large and has full port facilities. So if you were coming up from the south, and MacArthur's going to be coming up from places like Australia to the Solomons and New Guinea, it's the obvious choice for the first landing. It's the easiest place to come. The Japanese had already invaded Davao on December 20th during the early stages of the Philippine campaign, and they maintained a small presence there, consisting of a battalion-strength Miura detachment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Miura Toshio. Colonel Miura had tried to extend his control into the interior, but he was met with little success. Indeed, without air and artillery support, it was likely that American forces would have actually expelled his troops from the island. General Sharp had taken significant steps to prepare Mindanao, organizing the island into 5 defensive sectors: the Zamboanga sector, sorry, that was a hard one, Lanao sector in the northwest, the Cagayan sector in the north central region, the Agusan sector in the east, Cotabato Davao sector in the center, and the southern parts of the island. Despite some sporadic clashes along the Digos and the Agusan fronts in March, and some heavy action in Zamboanga, the Japanese largely remained in Davao, with Sharp's men continuing their training. The training time was immensely beneficial. However, the lack of ammunition was a significant drawback. Supplies were so restricted that live fire training was prohibited. Instead, the men just spent long hours practicing simulated fire, meaning that most of the soldiers who fought on Mindanao had actually never fired a live round before facing actual combat. Following the
It's kind of
fall of
reminds me, I don't know, some movie or video on YouTube, like the soldiers are training and oh sorry, I it was actually like I was reading this in actually in an audiobook about the Louisiana maneuvers that the United States had, and that time they were not even armed. So, like, I think a standing stick figure or something used to represent a tank, and you're just supposed to point your stick because most soldiers don't even have a gun, and you're supposed to say bang. That it kind of feels like that, with the lack of live fire training.
you got to make do with what you got. It could mean the slight difference when the combat actually happens. But yeah, it's not a good way to go about it. Following the fall of Panay and Cebu, Homa properly was going to be seizing Mindanao with a coordinated attack from 3 different directions. Mura was ordered to advance to Digos, a short distance to the south, where he would then strike towards the Sade Highway. The other 2 forces, the Kawaguchi and Kawamura detachments, were each tasked with making amphibious landings. Kawaguchi was set to land his troops at Cotabato, midway along the western coast at the mouth of the Mindanao River. From Cotabato, he would then dispatch the men to travel to Route 1, continuing east towards the Sara Highway to rendezvous with Mura. The remainder of his force would then land at Parang. It's about 12 miles north of Cotabato. Then they would push north along Route 1, past Lake Lanyo, then eastward to integrate with the Kawamura detachment. Kawamura was to come ashore at the head of the Manila Bay in northern Mindanao. Then the starting point would be at the Sara Highway. A small portion of his forces would strike west to join the Kawaguchi's detachment, while the majority would march south through the central parts of Mindanao along places like the Sara Highway. Ultimately, all 3 detachments aimed to march towards their convergence, encircling and neutralizing the Americans on the 3 fronts. Now, in
So
late
it's almost like
April,
they're moving from different directions to converge, kind of on the center of the island for
yeah, it's
the
a pretty
most
simplistic
way.
plan. Yeah, like you said, if you were looking at a map of the island, they're coming at 3 different points, and then they're kind of going into the center to meet up, basically.
Way more simpler than what they planned for Midway.
Yeah, exactly. In late April, 3 battalions of the 10th Independent Garrison assumed garrison duties on Mindanao, Cebu, and Panay, freeing up Mura's, men so that they could move south and do the Digos operation. Meanwhile, Kawaguchi embarked from Cebu on the 26th using 6 transports, escorted by 2 destroyers. 5 days later, Kawamura departed from Panay. General Wainwright's directive to Sharp on the 30th was to hold as much of Mindanao as possible with the forces at his disposal, which is not an easy feat, to say the least. Early on the 29th, coinciding with Emperor Hirohito's birthday, the Kawaguchi detachment began landing at Cotabato and Parang. Defending Cotabato was the 101st Division, 2nd Battalion of the 104th Infantry, and a battalion of the 101st Field Artillery, all led by Lieutenant Colonel Russell Nelson. He had positioned half of his forces around the town, and the remainder were placed further inland to cover Route 1. Kawaguchi's men faced very little resistance upon landing at Cotabato. However, when they began their advance into the town, it became more challenging. The Allied forces resisted tenaciously until Japanese aircraft from Zamboanga joined the fight, driving the defenders towards the outskirts of Cotabato. Over in Parang, the forces made contact with Allied defenders at around 3:30 p.m. near the junction of Route 1. They were holding firm for about 3 hours before they had to withdraw along the highway. This basically left the road open to Cotabato, and it flanked the defenders' rear, forcing the Allied forces to reluctantly abandon their positions in the city's outskirts, and they were all retreating along Route 1. The following day, Kawaguchi commenced his advance east towards the Sade Highway to connect with the forces of Mura. With air support, he encountered very little resistance that day. Colonel Nelson received reports of Japanese troop movements, but he was actually more concerned with the Japanese forces sailing up the river. He had no means of preventing these troops from disembarking along the riverbanks and moving to any point along Route 1, potentially creating roadblocks behind his men. Before the day concluded, he had received reports of Japanese units moving up the river, specifically Kawaguchi's men utilizing armored barges. He then found himself in quite a precarious position. These river units threatened to cut off his forces. Thus, he decided to destroy the roads and the bridges as his men began to withdraw. There was nothing really preventing Kawaguchi's men from consolidating control over the entirety of Route 1 from Cotabato to Bikit. Kawaguchi's forces advanced rapidly east towards the Sade Highway, attempting to cut off the Allies' escape route. Now, if he could reach Cabacan before them, he could actually encircle most of them and position himself, along their lines. The subsequent 2 days were marked with some skirmishes and aerial attacks. By May the 2nd, Colonel Mura launched a full-scale assault, bringing in a 4-hour artillery and mortar barrage supported by aerial strafing. This attack was followed by an offensive involving 3 tanks. By 5 p.m., the Filipino defenders had managed to repel the Japanese assault successfully. 2 hours later, they were ordered to withdraw towards the Sade Highway, which they did under the cover of darkness. The Kawaguchi forces then reached Cabacan, but they arrived too late to actually trap the Allied forces. Meanwhile, on the morning of the 29th, the Japanese faced strong resistance on the beaches of Parang. Intense machine gun fire was unleashed upon them, prolonging the fight for over 6 hours. Ultimately, the Allied defenders had to retreat to avoid being outflanked, allowing the Japanese to seize Parang. The Japanese subsequently marched on Malabang, located just 22 miles northwest. Rather than march his men along the 22-mile stretch of Route 1, Kawaguchi opted to leave a small garrison at Parang, and he transported his forces, initially landed on Mindanao, to come ashore at Malabang. The Japanese began landing a few miles south of the town, and by dawn on April the 30th, they commenced their assault on the Filipino defenders. After several hours and a lot of heavy casualties, the defenders had no choice but to pull back, despite a brave counterattack led by the forces under Colonel Yuji Mitchell. This left the defenders retreating along Route 1. However, the Japanese pursued them quite closely, routing the defenders and managing to capture Colonel Mitchell in the process. Now the Japanese had control over Route 1, extending their reach as far as the northern parts of Lake Lanao. Kawaguchi's forces advanced towards the town of Ganassi, situated near the southwestern corner of Lake Lanao, where Colonel Vesey was stationed. A minor skirmish occurred at Ganassi on the morning of May the 2nd, prompting Vesey to deem the town completely indefensible, and he withdrew his men to another town named Bacolod, located on the western shore of Lake Lanao. And I'm sure there's Philippine members in the audience who are just cringing at how I'm pronouncing some of these towns again. I apologize. The Japanese consolidated their position at Ganassi, while Vesey destroyed a bridge across Route 1 in a bid to impede their advance. This caused a temporary halt to the Japanese forces, and to compound their woes, the Japanese tanks that were attempting to cross the stream were struck by 2.95-inch mountain guns, rendered inoperative. Vesey had positioned this mountain gun at a perfect angle to target the Japanese as they were approaching the bridge, and as an eyewitness would remark at the time, it made up for the lack of accuracy with point-blank concentration. So the Japanese had to dismount from their trucks, and the casualties began to mount from there. In spite of the setback, Kawaguchi ordered his troops to press on, and soon their artillery and their air support began to take a toll on the defenders. By the late afternoon, Colonel Vesey was compelled to withdraw his men. But with this victory, Kawaguchi had basically consolidated control over the southern and the western parts of Mindanao, leaving just the northern region still in contention. Meanwhile, the Kawamura detachment landed at the mouths of the Cagayan and Taguluan rivers during the early hours of May the 3rd, and with the support of their destroyers and aircraft, Kawamura's forces swiftly came ashore, encountering such intense resistance that the local commander, Major Webb, noted only the withdrawal of the 61st Field Artillery, with his right flank exposed, Webb was forced to withdraw from the beachhead engagement. General Sharp had held on to his reserves up till this point, but now he unleashed them in a desperate attempt to halt the Japanese advance along the Saudi Highway. With the Japanese having secured half of the island, and being just a dozen miles from General Sharp's HQ, it was time to exhaust all of his available options. They brought up with them what remained of their artillery for Mindanao, and that was just 3 2.95-inch guns. General Sharp established a defensive position parallel at the Magyama Canyon, and he was barely able to set up his guns when at 7:30 a.m. the Japanese began emerging from the Saudi Highway. The initial Japanese assault was repelled, forcing them back about 700 yards. The Japanese failed to capitalize on their advantage, leading Sharp to conclude events seemed to be moving satisfactorily. Although the enemy did control the beaches and the northern terminus of the Sade Highway, Sharp's forces had disengaged without very excessive loss, and they are now relatively accommodating defensive posture. The general was optimistic enough to instruct his staff to prepare plans for a northward counterattack along the highway for the following morning. The optimism soon evaporated, however, when reports indicated that Colonel Morse had to withdraw his men from their defensive position astride the Sade Highway. This is about 6 miles south of the beach. All hopes for counterattacks had pretty much lost at that point. General Sharp subsequently ordered all of his forces to defend two towns, Puntian and Dalarig. Controlling these two towns would allow the defenders to impede any movements down the Sade Highway, leading into the central part of Mindanao. By May the 4th, the defenders had established all their positions, and on May the 5th, they faced Japanese bombardment. Until the 8th, they endured artillery and air assaults, followed up by some night raids from Kawamura's forces. In the darkness, many of
That
his
would have
troops...
been that would have been quite a terrifying prospect for the defenders.
Yes, but I think at this point, they're getting more and more used to it. It's going to definitely be, the staple of what the Japanese are doing on any of these offensives. So I think after it's been repeated a few times, you get into a rhythm of what to expect.
True
But
enough. Especially I'm just factoring in that these have generally been raw troops, and this fighting
yes,
in the last few days was the only time they fired with live ammunition. So the sounds would still scare them, or at least jolt them initially.
of course. And like any military at this time, it was unusual to fight at night. It was almost expected that you just stopped playing war at night. I don't know. It's not proper to say that, but in a lot of ways, that's how they treated it. So yeah, they're going to be scared. In the
It's
darkness,
always controlled, right?
yeah, exactly. In the darkness, many of his troops successfully infiltrated the Filipino defensive lines at Dadaig, creating absolute chaos. Amidst the confusion, two defending platoons just somehow received orders to withdraw, so they pulled back from their positions. Before HQ could rectify whatever was going on, the Japanese infiltrators began to fortify their positions, leading to more nighttime conflicts. By the morning, the exhausted and now disorganized Filipino forces were compelled to retreat from their main defensive lines and withdraw into Dalarig. Kawamura then pushed his advantage, assaulting the retreating defenders in Dalarig from three sides. The defenders scattered in all directions, leaving only two scout companies in the town to make a valiant stand before they too had to retreat or be encircled. All retreating defenders were forced to cross a flat, open countryside devoid of any cover. They were pursued relentlessly by artillery fire and aircraft, leading to significant casualties. Many men cast away their weapons in the flight, resulting in a total rout. By the end of the 9th, the Dalarig force had virtually ceased to exist. In Putan, forces under Colonel Dalton were engaged in combat against more of Kawamura's troops. However, with the fall of Dalarig, Dalton recognized that the Japanese could just outflank Puntan's northern edge. Knowing that the Japanese would cut off his only escape routes, he realized there's no way out. General Sharp understood that the entire defensive perimeter was now falling apart and that the bulk of his forces were being decimated. So he radioed MacArthur stating, "North front in full retreat. The enemy is coming through the right flank. Nothing further can be done. May sign off any time now." Thus, Mindanao had fallen. The most critical piece of the puzzle still remained, and that being Corregidor. So, we are now going to be switching to a new map, and I'm going to try to zoom out. I realize this is zoomed in pretty heavily. Here we go. So for those not on YouTube, this is a map of the full layout of the Corregidor defenses, 1942. Well, the most critical piece, as I mentioned, of this entire puzzle was Corregidor, often referred to as the Rock, or the Gibraltar of the East by Americans, of course. That term was used by the British for Singapore. And it was home to about 13,000 troops.
We're just about to comment on that. Sorry, Singapore considered the Gibraltar of the East.
Yeah. So I guess the Americans wanted to, have their own. The island was fortified with
East. It's more east.
The island was fortified with anti-aircraft guns, artillery, all sorts of cannons. Many considered it to be an impregnable stronghold. General Waywright maintained control over Manila Bay by utilizing its 56 coastal guns, mortars, about 48.50 caliber machine guns, 28 3-inch guns, and 10 Spurry searchlights, all part of the harbor defenses led by General Moore. Corregidor was additionally protected by 3 heavily fortified islands in Manila Bay: Caballo Island with Fort Hughes, Carabao Island with Fort Frank, and Efreo Island with Fort Drum. From December the 28th to January the 6th, Corregidor experienced regular bombardments from the Japanese 5th Air Group, led by Lieutenant General Obata Hideyoshi. Oh, actually, I know this commander somewhat well. He's an interesting one. He has an extensive history. While the attacks left the island armaments largely unscathed, they did not cause significant structural damage and severely, demoralized the troops. The defenders were on the brink of depleting their supplies, subsisting on, just 30 ounces of food per day, much more than the guys at Bataan, mind you, just to put that out there. When the enemy bombardments resulted in the death of the cavalry's horses, soldiers would drag their carcasses into the mess hall for sustenance, which is kind of sad, but, a necessity. Despite submarines bringing
You
in
go, you study the old sieges when those cities under, like Mantua, for example, in our Rivoli episode, at the time of that battle, yeah, the soldiers were living on horses while the civilians were on, cats, dogs, rats, whatever they could find.
Yep. And you know what, Gareth? Like I said to you once, at some point we're going to do a Taiping Rebellion series. And you know what they eat during those sieges?
Everything?
Their friends and family members. It's so horrifying. And again, I know
I
this
guess
is
my
like totally.
everything comment is still valid technically.
This is so left field to bring up, but just to give people an idea, because a lot of people in the West have never heard of this. It is the bloodiest civil war in human history. Human flesh was like sold in the black market in some of these places that were being besieged. It's it's horrifying the stories of what happened to civilian populations during that rebellion. But I desist. That's a story for another day. There were submarines bringing some food, mail, and munitions in as much as they could manage. But these efforts, obviously, they fell short, and the garrison was ultimately doomed by a lack of supplies. As General Homa's artillery began to turn Corregidor into kind of like a no man's land, a favored song broke out amongst the men. And it went something like this: I'm waiting for ships that never come in. Yeah.
Reminds me of the Linkin Park song, "A Light That Never Comes."
Yeah, exactly. Some garrison members questioned whether the V's chalked on their helmets was for victory or actually if it stood for victim. And I have to admit, I took this one from a book by Frank Costello. He loves to put in those little tidbit information parts. And yeah, he's good at writing that stuff. It became a matter of when, not if, when the fortress, would fall. Throughout February, the Kondo detachment, commanded by Major Kondo Toshinori, employed 4 105mm guns and 2 150mm guns, later reinforced with 2 additional 150mm howitzers to bombard the island. Yet they failed to inflict significant damage. Because for those who don't know, there's an entire network. It's the Malenta tunnels. Think of Corregidor like full of just underground networks and concrete bunkers and such. It's very well fortified. You can withstand quite a bombing. By March the 15th, new reinforcements arrived to intensify the bombardment from Pico de Loro, causing further damage to Forts Frank and Drum. After the fall of Bataan, General Homa positioned his heaviest artillery on the slopes of Marivel's mountains to commence inflicting devastating damage. On April the 12th onwards, the famed gun emplacements at Corregidor engaged in a protracted duel with the Japanese artillery. The island's 12-inch guns from batteries on Corregidor and Fort Drum, with their 36-foot reinforced concrete encasements, severely battered the Japanese positions. However, over the following 2 weeks, Japanese artillery gradually wore down the American guns, and more importantly, their crews. General Sergeant Waldron recounted the experience of being under fire. He had this to say: sometimes the shells would come so fast and explode so close together that we stayed inside of our tunnels. Nothing could survive that shelling. The enemy would pick out an area and start walking shells across it, and when they were through, it would look like no man's land. For the troops, the prolonged tension of being under fire was just unbearable. I mean, this is basically like World War I kind of, it's a World War I kind of scenario. Waldron remembered a sergeant named Rawlings who, quote, whose nerves just went to pieces, and whenever he gave the command to commence firing, he would take off through the jungle, not knowing or caring where he ran. That's classic shell shock behavior, basically. On April the 29th, artillery fire and
It's not
bombing from the
a
Jap.
Let's not get pattern here.
Yeah. On April the 29th, artillery fire and bombing from the Japanese reached a crescendo. It was Emperor Hirohito's birthday, as I mentioned before. Two ammunition dumps exploded, solid rock cliffs were literally shattered, and uncontrollable grass fires were sweeping this very small island, sending thick clouds of dust and smoke everywhere. By the end of April, the American troops' ability to return fire had significantly diminished, despite the continued availability of thousands of shells. In contrast, the intensity of the Japanese bombardment was escalating, flooding Corregidor with thousands and thousands of shells. By May the 5th, most of Corregidor's guns had fallen silent, and the defenders anticipated an impending invasion. That invasion would be executed by the 4th Division under General Quetano, who was tasked with conducting two consecutive amphibious assaults. One with the 61st Regiment, and some tanks from the 7th Tank Regiment. We're going to be landing between Infantry Point and Cavalry Point. Just want to check out my map to see if I have, Cavalry Point is
Yeah,
in the northeast.
they are both at the narrower end of the island on the eastern part.
Perfect. Yes, again, for all of you not watching on YouTube, this is a very detailed map of the Battle of Corregidor, and it very much helps with the geography, to say the least.
But this is, I think, from the U.S. invasion, right? During the conquest.
Well, let me check. It might be, but it was the best I could find. Yeah, but it still gives it the.
I
Yes,
think it's
it
just the
does.
details that are important.
Yeah, it gives all the areas because I couldn't find one that had the Japanese invasion itself. And another involving the 37th Regiment with a battalion of the 8th Regiment and an element of the 7th Tank Regiment landing between Battery Point and Morrison Point. Concurrently, the 16th Division will launch a feint attack from Cavite against Forts Frank and Drum, somewhat reminiscent of the assault on Singapore Island. After 27 days of siege, the Japanese artillery had inflicted so much damage that the aerial bombers felt emboldened to fly lower and then strike harder, as anti-aircraft guns seemed to be rendered ineffective. The only refuge.
Can I just say,
yeah,
this is just such a sign of confidence because Japanese aircraft were really thinly armored. You might make the case for the Spitfire being unarmored, but Japanese aircraft were even worse. So the fact that they were willing to go down, it just shows they are completely believing that the defenders have lost it.
Yep. And now for the defenders, the only safe place for refuge was the Malinta tunnels, which housed, a bomb-proof shelter for the headquarters, the hospital, the shops, the warehouses on Corregidor. However, the Malinta tunnels were not a suitable place for combat. Life outside the tunnels was perilous, but at least there was fresh air and light. The 10,000 people residing in the sprawling underground complex were suffering from intolerable tension, a phenomenon dubbed as tunnelitis. Dust made breathing difficult, and the stench of death from the hospital inflicted everyone. The heat was also suffocating, and there was huge black flies, roaches, and other insects invading the area. Just to say, people were starting to lose their shit in the tunnels. On May the 3rd, General Waywright received alarming news.
Quite literally.
Yes. General Waywright received alarming news that water supplies were critically low, prompting him to radio MacArthur stating, "The situation is fast becoming desperate." And the following day, 16,000 shells rained down on the island as terrified men huddled in their foxholes, fire, filling themselves with rage towards, what they would call the tunnel rats, those people lucky enough to be in the Malinta tunnels. However, those within the tunnels were not faring that well either. Many were on the brink of hysteria. That day, Wainwright composed a letter to Marshall stating this: "It is in my opinion, the enemy is capable of making an assault on Corregidor at any time. The success or failure of such an assault will depend entirely on the steadfastness of beach defense troops. Considering the present level of morale, I estimate that we have something less than an even chance to beat off the initial assault. I have given you, in accordance with your request, a very frank and honest opinion on the situation as I see it." The Japanese bombardment seemed to be concentrating its fire on a narrow tail end of the island, suggesting that would be the focal point of the invasion. To the defenders' horror, the intensity of the bombardment escalated right up until May the 5th. Believe it or not, General Homa was once again behind schedule, though. Corregidor should have fallen 2 weeks earlier. But the invasion had been postponed due to malaria epidemics that were going on amongst the Japanese troops. It was only quelled by quinine tablets that were had to be flown in directly from Japan. On the evening of May the 4th, Homa watched anxiously from above the harbor of Lama as landing crafts carrying about 2,000 men and several tanks disappeared into the dusk en route to the rock. The odds were quite chilling, as the assault troops faced at least 7 times their number. In the darkness, erratic tides and currents pushed the small invasion fleet a mile off course. As the first boats approached the shore, they were met with significant fire from two 75mm guns. Surprisingly, the defenders valiantly manned some of the remaining batteries and sank several of these boats, inflicting hundreds of casualties. Boat after boat was blown out of the water. The barrage was so intense that many of the invaders leapt from their boats, and then they were dragged underwater by nearly 100 pounds of equipment on them. Less than a third of the assault force actually survived. They landed further east than anticipated, near North Point, and Colonel Gempachi Seto led the men west towards the Malinta Hill and south against a place called Monkey Point. At about midnight, a Marine messenger dashed into the tunnels, shouting, "600 Japs have just landed." For 3 hours, Wainwright remained in suspense until news arrived that a Marine anti-aircraft gun pit a mile from his tunnel had been captured. Moments later, a radiogram came in from FDR, praising the defenders as, quote, "living symbols of our war aims and the guarantee of victory," which,
I don't think
yeah.
any of these guys are going to be pretty impressed with that title.
It's kind of like, okay, The Japanese pressed on towards the Malinta Tunnel's entrance under very heavy fire, fending off 3 consecutive counterattacks. Just before dawn, 500 untrained sailors, the last reserves, emerged from the tunnel and they crawled towards the fighting. Alongside the Marines of the HQ and service company, they launched an attack that completely caught the Japanese off guard, as they awaited aerial and tank support, forcing them to fall back on both flanks. Then at 10 a.m., the American defenders could hear the horrifying sound, rumble, that is, of tanks. In hindsight, it was a glaring oversight that MacArthur never deployed any tanks to Corregidor to assist in its defense. It's just, one last thing I guess you could say that MacArthur fucked up, but in my opinion, why would you have tanks on Corregidor when they'd be better used at Bataan? So I wouldn't actually blame him on this one.
If you just look at the terrain, it looks like there's elevation. So tanks don't do well with elevated and narrow terrain. So kind of makes sense.
Your batteries and your guns are more than adequate for this kind of fight. I don't think tanks would have made the difference. Anti-tank weapons would have, because it's very, a concentrated area to fight, a lot of places to hide. Once Wainwright learned,
guns, not anti-tank guns.
True. Once Wainwright learned that armor was moving against his men, and he had no anti-tank defenses, a nightmare flickered into his mind, and as he described it at the time, a tank nosing into the tunnel, spraying lead at the wounded and merces. So that's pretty horrifying if you have no ability to take out these tanks, other than, Molotov cocktails, which absolutely would work on the Japanese tank models. They had open shafts and stuff. Wainwright turned to his staff and he said, "We can't hold out much longer." He had lost an estimated 800 soldiers by that point, and he recognized that further resistance was futile. What Wainwright did not realize was that the Japanese had suffered a staggering 70% casualty rate during the landing of their 2,000 troops, and they were on their last legs. General Homa had depleted the last of his reserves. It was actually a pretty close battle. At about 10:15 a.m., he ordered Brigadier General Louis Beebe to broadcast a previously prepared surrender message. And in a choked voice, Wainwright instructed, "Tell the Japs that we'll cease firing at noon." To limit the surrender to the 4 islands in Manila Bay, he radioed Major General Sharp, transferring official command of the rest of the Philippines to him. Guns were spiked, codes were burned, and radio equipment was destroyed. Wainwright wrote his final message to FDR, and this is what it had to say. "With a broken heart and a head bowed in sadness, but not in shame, I report to Your Excellency that today I must arrange terms for the surrender of the fortified islands of Manila Bay. There is a limit of the human endurance, and that limit has long since been passed. Without a prospect of relief, I feel it is my duty to my country and to my gallant troops to end this useless effusion of blood and human sacrifice. If you agree, Mr. President, please say to the nation that my troops and I have accomplished all that is humanly possible, and that we have upheld the best traditions of the United States and its army. May God bless and preserve you and guide you and the nation in the effort to achieve ultimate victory. With profound regret and a continued pride in my gallant troops, I go to meet the Japanese commander." Psst. Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor minute by minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself? Uh-oh, you live in Japan and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh no, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it, without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Goodbye, Mr. President. Yeah. So, Wainwright would later remark, it was the terror vested in a tank that was the decisive factor. I envisioned the devastation that even one of those could wreak if it nosed into the tunnel where our helpless wounded and their brave nurses lay. That was ultimately why he tossed in the towel, and everything is of course hindsight. If he had known the plight of the Japanese, I think he would have continued the fight, but of course, hindsight. For the fighting men, it was pretty traumatic. Colonel Howard of the 4th Marines broke down sobbing, and he had to say this at the time: "My God, and I had to be the first Marine officer ever to surrender a regiment. All American guns ceased firing. Wainwright waited about 2 hours, then he drove east in a Chevrolet with 5 staff members to Denver Hill. They proceeded on foot past the dead and the dying, and they were met near the top of the hill by a group of Japanese soldiers. A Japanese lieutenant stated that the surrender must encompass all American and Filipino troops in the entire Philippine archipelago. Wainwright responded, 'I do not choose to discuss surrender terms with you. Take me to your senior officer.' Colonel Moto Nakayama, the same officer who accepted King's surrender of Bataan, stepped forward, and Wainwright informed him that he would surrender the 4 islands of Manila Bay. Nakayama replied angrily that he had explicit orders from General Homa to bring Wainwright to Bataan for the capitulation ceremony, only if he agreed to relinquish all troops. Now, at that moment, General Homa was unaware that Corregidor was prepared to surrender. A report that indicated about 31 boats had been sunk during the night, which is pretty horrifying if you're a general. Oh, man, that's bad.
Well,
Resulting in
it's
the
70% of his post, right?
It's like, holy shit. Can you imagine if that happened to Yamashita with Singapore? Because that was a very real. If it hadn't been for his clever little ploys, that was definitely could have happened. Anyways, resulting in the cancellation of the reinforcement wave, leaving about 21 landing crafts available. So yeah, he screwed up, to say the least. Those aware that disgrace awaited them, Homa was suddenly, buoyed by a staff officer bursting in with news that a white flag of truce had been flung over Corregidor. Homa was so relieved that he radioed Nakayama, instructing him to disregard previous orders and escort Wainwright to Bataan immediately. At about 4 p.m., Wainwright, leaning heavily on a cane at this point, appearing quite thin, set foot on Bataan soil at Kabakben. 2 cars transported him and his party to a small blue-painted house. The Americans waited on an open porch overlooking the southern expanse of Manila Bay, where Corregidor was still erupting in shell bursts. The battle had not yet ended, as the Japanese saw it. Wainwright and his colleagues were served cold water, and they were posed, for photographs taken by the Japanese newsmen, because of course the Japanese had, their propaganda tour over there. At 5 p.m., a Cadillac approached, carrying the barrel-chested General Homa, who looked crisp and vigorous in his olive-drab uniform. He welcomed the Americans, remarking, "You must be very tired and weary." Wainwright expressed his gratitude, and they sat together on a porch around a long table. Wainwright then presented a single note surrendering Corregidor, along with Forts Frank, Drum, and Hughes. Homa, who was proficient in English, he was, of course, someone who went overseas, wanted his staff to fully understand the proceedings, so he had an interpreter read the document aloud. With a stony expression, he stated that he could only accept the surrender of all troops in the Philippines. Wainwright then retorted, "The troops in the Visayas and Mindanao areas are no longer under my command. They are commanded by General Sharp, who in turn is under General MacArthur's high command." Homa flushed, feeling as though he was being made a fool. He instructed the interpreter to inform Wainwright that the Japanese had intercepted messages from Washington affirming Wainwright's position as the commander-in-chief of all Philippine forces. Wainwright steadily insisted that he had no authority over General Sharp, however. General Homa lost his temper, slamming his fists on the table while facing his chief of staff, stating in Japanese, "What should we do, Wachi?" Major General Takaji Wachi suggested that he believed Wainwright was just lying to them. In response, General Homa declared, "In that case, we cannot negotiate. Let us continue the battle." Regaining his composure, he said calmly to Wainwright, "Since you are not in supreme command, I see no further necessity for my presence here." And as he was, doing that motion to prepare to leave, one of Waywright's staff members, alarmed, shouted, "Wait!" The Americans quickly convened a conference. Pale-faced, Wainwright turned to Homa and he said this, "In light of the fact that any further bloodshed in the Philippines is unnecessary and futile, I will assume command of all American forces in the Philippines, even at the risk of serious reprimand from my government following the war." Despite this, Homa was offended and skeptical of Wainwright's sincerity. He instructed the Americans to return to Corregidor and reconsider the matter. Homa then stated, "If you see fit to surrender, then do so to the commanding officer of the regiment on Corregidor. He will in turn bring you to me in Manila. I declare this meeting over. Good day." With that, General Homa nodded to the Americans and he walked towards his Cadillac. Wainwright chewed his cigarette
I
into
can't
shreds.
fully, I can't fully blame Homa because Wainwright was obviously the commander.
Yeah, Wainwright
So-
was screwing him. Yeah, and I mean, Homa was being just, you have to take it from his viewpoint. This has been nothing but the nail in the coffin of his career. This whole campaign.
Yeah,
It's bad.
I guess you can only take it out on Wainwright or the commanding officer, since he knows he's going to get axed by Tokyo.
And you also have to take into into perspective. Homa is aware and he sees newsreels of like the great triumphs of General Yamashita in like Malaya and Singapore, and how he he got this surrender of a force that was even bigger than his own, and da. So it looks bad.
And
It really,
and I'm pretty sure he would have also known that the very specific islands have fallen. Hong Kong has fallen as per the schedule, basically, and he's delayed it like months.
Oh yeah, it's not good. Wainwright, and I forget if I got this. I read, I think it's still Frank Costello, this quote comes from, but he was saying Wainwright literally chewed his cigarettes to shreds because he was like a nervous wreck during all this. And he turned to Nakayama and he asked, "What do you want us to do now?" Nakayama replied, "We will take you and your party back to Corregidor, and you can do as you please." Some miscommunication ensued as everyone, was relying on this one interpreter, Kazuma Uno, who had actually grown up in Utah. It's a nice fact. Uno sympathized with the Americans' plight, and he explained to Nakayama that Wainwright was indeed ready to surrender all of the Philippines. Nakayama sighed, and he stated he would accompany Wainwright back to Corregidor, adding, "First thing tomorrow morning, you will present a new surrender to General Homa and promise to communicate with the other American forces in the Philippines." So, as he returned, Wainwright observed campfires throughout Corregidor, surmising that the Japanese had already landed all of the reinforcements. He was guided around Malinta's Hill and introduced to the island commander, Colonel Seto. The Malinta tunnel had been cleared, except for those in the hospital. Seto was preparing to attack the main part of the island, topside. Wainwright was informed that only an unconditional surrender would spare his men from the absolute slaughter. Under some dim lighting, Wainwright would sign a document accepting all of Homa's original demands. By midnight, Wainwright was escorted to the western entrance of the Malinta tunnel, and as he walked by, American and Filipinos reached out to touch his hand and pat him on the shoulder, saying, "It's all right, General. You did your best." Wainwright's humiliation was actually only just beginning.
Can I just also add this fact that the Filipinos and American soldiers who were fighting at this particular engagement, they don't have a very high opinion of MacArthur. They resented him,
not.
obviously. But Wainwright was considered that fighting general who would even be touring the front lines, even when they were on Bataan and fighting on the main Luzon areas. Personally, I always respect such commanders way more than those who would just be in the command bunker.
Yeah, and Wainwright was humiliated after this. The American press, and I don't want to say this is directly because of MacArthur, but he was seen as capitulating to the enemy, and he shouldn't have surrendered when he did and such. And the tragedy, like you mentioned, is from the very beginning of the invasion, he was a frontline commander. He was a kind of soldier. He was fighting with the men. And some of the great counterattacks in the defensive lines in Luzon was all coordinated by him. Then during the Battle of Bataan, he was at the front lines again, and he was a hero for sure.
Yeah, and MacArthur screws him over.
Oh yeah, holy shit, yeah, it's absolutely insane.
And mid 1942, he was to be awarded a Medal of Honor.
Yep,
for his command and conduct
and it was
in
MacArthur.
the defense. Yeah, and it was only after the war when he was released that MacArthur would, not raise opposition to Wainwright being given the Medal of Honor.
Yeah. I do happen to know MacArthur personally apologized to Wainwright after the war upon seeing what had become of him, because as you can imagine, Wainwright was a POW and he was a skeleton. Especially if you've ever seen some of the video and photos of him on the during the surrender process on the boat, it's it's rough. But like I was saying, Wainwright's simulation is just beginning.
To that image, right? MacArthur meets him in August 1945 again. You can see MacArthur is still healthy, and then Wainwright is just skin and bones. Like you can see the bones and everything on his neck in that image when they embrace.
And everyone has to kind of remember, Wainwright went in as a general for the POW process. They should technically be treated a little bit better than the rest, and even he was starving because Japan had simply no food to give their people alone, let alone the POWs. But the following morning, he was summoned by his operations officer, Colonel Trewick, who had informed him that the Japanese would fly him to Mindanao to personally deliver a letter to General Sharp, which read, "You will therefore be guided accordingly, and will surrender all troops under your command, both in the Visayan Islands and Mindanao, to the proper Japanese officer. This decision on my part, you will realize, was forced upon me by means beyond my control." Colonel Trewick was authorized to arrest General Sharp if he failed to comply with the instructions. Wainwright, feeling rather powerless, said, "Jesse, I'm depending on you to carry out these orders." Later that afternoon, Wainwright and 5 of his officers were taken by boat to Bataan, where they received their first food in about 2 days. It was rice and fish. Afterwards, they were transported by car to Manila, where they met with Lieutenant Hisemichi Kano of the Propaganda Corps. This man was he was educated in New York and New Jersey. Kano greeted Wainwright warmly, offering him some fruit. Wainwright was compelled to read a prepared speech. It was a mixture of his letter to Sharp and some Japanese adjustments to it. As he addressed General Sharp in the message, it stated this: "You will repeat the complete text of this letter and such other instructions as Colonel Trewick will give you by radio to General MacArthur. However, let me emphasize that there must be, on your part, no thought of disregarding these instructions. Failure to fully and honestly carry them out can have only the most disastrous results. If and when such faithfulness of execution is recognized, the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese forces in the Philippine Islands will order that all firing cease. Taking all circumstances into consideration, and then it would trail off and it would go through the surrender process. Now, after a very long pause while he was doing this recording, the Filipino announcer, Marcela Victor Young, interpreted and signed off at about 12:20 a.m. on May the 8th. Kano offered the Americans, after they'd done this recording, some scotch, as the speech resonated throughout the Philippines, both for the Americans and the Filipinos. General Sharp was at a loss as to what to do. That very morning, he received a message from Wainwright's relinquishing of his command over to him, and now it seemed like he was, reverting on those orders. So he consulted MacArthur for advice. MacArthur responded via radio stating, "Give no credence in the alleged broadcast by Wainwright." So that broadcast, as it was read out, was something like this. "Orders emanating from General Wainwright have no validity. If possible, separate your force into small elements and initiate guerrilla operations. You, of course, have full authority to make any decisions that keep in communication with me as much as possible. You are gallant and a resourceful commander, and I am so proud of what you have done." So, MacArthur's, still trying to keep this thing alive, even though it's putting everybody else in danger on Corregidor, and all the POWs for that matter in northern Luzon. General Sharp found very little reassurances in MacArthur's reply, and he chose to wait for Wainwright's emissary to come over. 2 days later, upon Trewick's arrival, Sharp read Wainwright's letter and determined there was basically no alternative. He immediately ordered the commanders of the various islands to cease all operations against the Japanese army at once. And then he radioed MacArthur saying, "Dire necessity alone has prompted this action." To this, MacArthur sent a message to Washington received by General Marshall. This is what it said. "I have just received word from Major General Sharp that General Wainwright, in 2 broadcasts on the night of April the 7th and 8th, announced he was resuming command of all forces in the Philippines and directed their surrender, giving in detail the method of accomplishment. I believe Wainwright has temporarily become unbalanced, and his condition renders him susceptible to enemy use." Yeah. But you know what? Despite every political ploy that's happening in the background, the Philippines had now fallen. General Homa was not in a celebratory mood. He was disfavored by the Army General Staff due to his numerous requests for reinforcements and his failure to meet many deadlines at this point. Moreover, General and Count Hisayashi Teraichi of the Southern Army was quite pissed off with Homa's lenient treatment of Filipino civilians. Homa had forbidden pillage and rape, instructing his troops to respect Filipino customs, traditions, and religion. In his defense, Homa argued that he was following the emperor's directives to bring enlightenment to Southeast Asia as part of, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and all that propaganda. We'll get into that some other time. Homa confronted Teraichi, asserting that the Americans had not exploited the Philippines and that making false statements about their brutal colonization efforts, was unjust. Which Homa was wrong about, by the way. The Americans were rough with the Philippines. Anyways, he actually had this quote to say: "They administered a very benevolent supervision over the Philippines. Japan should establish an even better and more enlightened supervision." Which, Homa is absolutely right about. If Homa was in charge of some of the larger campaigns in the Asian mainland, maybe more groups of Asians would actually join the Japanese.
Well, with their logistics of planning the war, in terms of feeding the populations, I'm a bit skeptical.
His insistence on tolerance only strengthened Teraichi's resolve to send more negative reports to Tokyo regarding his actions, leading our friend Tsuji, to countermand Homa's orders. Without Homa's awareness, as was the case with General Yamashita, 2 days after Wainwright's surrender, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi barged into Homa's office, accusing him of authorizing the execution of Chief Justice Jose Abons Santos,
So this
demanding to know
is
why.
Suji's modus of operandi.
It's the regular Tsoji stuff that we keep hearing about, all the way from the Malaya campaigns to here. Santos had been willing to cooperate with the Japanese. However, upon Kawaguchi's radio communication to Manila, he received an order stating, "His guilt is obvious. Dispose of him immediately." Kawaguchi viewed this as a complete betrayal of the Bushido Code and of Emperor Hirohito, and he expelled a staff officer from Manila named Inosuke for suggesting the execution of Santos' son as well. Kawaguchi wrote to an old
Kawaguchi was
friend.
one of the more, you could say, more honorable
Yes,
Japanese
yeah.
commanders in the war.
And if I do remember, he has one of the best mustaches. Not the best, but one of the best.
He had a pretty iconic mustache.
Yeah.
And pretty
I forget-
innovative.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the way he wanted to actually transport his detachment to Guadalcanal later. That probably would
I
have
mean,
been
yeah.
because the route that the army commanded ended up with like one regiment down in the bottom of the sea.
The ant transport, as it became known.
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, given the resources on hand, you have to grade it on a curve. It's stupid, but given what they were capable of doing, it was not a bad idea. I mean, they did.
It was
all the ideas.
relatively a better option. That's it.
Yeah, of course. Kawaguchi actually, at the time, wrote to an old friend, Major General Yoshihide Hayashi, the military administrator of the 14th Army, repeatedly advocating for the two Santos to be spared. 2 weeks later, Kawaguchi received a further dispatch from Manila, directing him to send both Santos to the Davao garrison for immediate execution. Although he crumpled the message in anger, Inosuke persistently urged him to ensure the order's execution. No pun intended. Kawaguchi summoned the two prisoners and informed them that he had done his utmost to save their lives, but was now compelled to execute the elder Santos. He reassured the elder, "I promise to protect your son, so don't worry." Santos, pleading for his life, claimed that he had never been anti-Japanese, stating, "I appreciate your kindness towards me and my son, and I wish for glory of your country." To his son, he said, "When you see your mother, give her my love. I will soon die. Be a man of honor and work for the Philippines." The elder Santos was taken to a nearby coconut plantation where he declined to be blindfolded before he was shot by firing squad. Which is always the choice, by the way. You want the guys to look in your eyes as they shoot you. It's an old one. General Homa was astounded to learn of Santos' execution from Kawaguchi. He held the man in high esteem and he valued his friendship. Homa remembered granting Kawaguchi's initial request for clemency and instructed Hayashi to handle the matter delicately. Homa was very distressed and he expressed to Kawaguchi, "I regret very much what has happened." The following day, Kawaguchi confronted Hayashi, demanding, "What keishikaran," which means shameful, "thing you have done? I trusted you as my classmate." Hayashi became very defensive, asserting that Homa had already reprimanded him. But Imperial Headquarters was so insistent about the execution of Santos. Now, hearing this, Kawaguchi inquired, "Whom do you mean by Imperial Headquarters?" To which Hayashi replied, "Well, it was Toichi." General Homa's composure kind of, fell apart at that. And he was determined to pursue Tsoiji for what he had done. A few weeks later, General Manuel Roxas, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Philippines, was captured on Mindanao. Orders arrived from Manila directing the local commander, General Tora Ikuta, to execute him, apparently, secretly, and immediately. That was what the order said. The order was authorized in Homa's name and stamped by Hayashi and 3 other staff officers. On Bataan, Ikuta initially refused to execute the prisoners without a written order, but even when presented with one, he found himself incapable of carrying it out, and he passed the responsibility to his chief of staff, Colonel Nobehiko Jimbo. Jimbo, who was a balding man with glasses and a Tojo-style mustache, who was of a Catholic faith, faced rather a torment as he drove Roxas and another high-ranking prisoner towards the execution grounds. The other prisoner, who was a former governor, rather than a soldier, pleaded for his life during the hour-long drive, claiming that he had always cooperated with the Japanese. As the man became increasingly hysterical, Roxas patted him on the shoulder, saying, "Look at the sambuquita, aren't they beautiful?" referencing the white blossoms native to the Philippines. Jimbo resolved to save the 2 men, He left them under guard in a small town, and he returned to Davao, hoping to persuade General Ikuta to disregard the execution order. Jimbo's arguments resonated with Ikuta, who decided to use Roxas to help restore law and order. In the meantime, they would keep him hidden and safe. Jimbo was court-martialed for his actions, and he flew to Manila to confront General Homa. But Homa was away, so Jimbo spoke instead with his chief of staff, General Wachi. Wachi was actually shocked by the orders, asserting that Homa would never have issued them. Although Wachi could not annul the orders, stamped by Hona's official name, he did suspend them temporarily, which is something he was allowed to do. Jimbo overheard Wachi go into a room and confront Hayashi, angrily questioning him. Did your men issue the orders to execute General Roxas? Hayashi and the others denied it, leading Wachi to shout, Colonel Jimbo, come in. Hayashi and the other staff officers glared at Jimbo as he presented the execution order, compelling them to confess that, that they had actually stamped it without giving it even that much thought. That's what they said.
And I'm guessing they were Suji's guys, right?
Not to say that they were loyal to Tsuji, it's just they were part
They
of an
resonated
element.
with him.
Yeah.
They
They all
resonated.
believed in the same. Yeah. There's a large group of Japanese who believed, like I said, it's the bastardization of the Bushido Code. These guys surrendered. They're the enemy. They don't deserve mercy and such. There's a lot of reasons. Hayashi turned on Jimbo, exclaiming, You have done a terrible thing to us. General Homa was quite pleased to learn of Jimbo's initiative, and he reported the entire situation directly to Emperor Hirohito. Roxas was spared, but the ordeal highlighted the erosion of Homa's command. His career was falling apart anyways. Tokyo was very dissatisfied with his lack of aggressiveness and his leniency towards the Filipinos. Ignoring his entire staff's advice, Homa ordered the release of the Filipino soldiers in the prison camps, but was subsequently relieved of his command, and he was ordered to return to Japan to retire in semi-disgrace, without the traditional report of a returning commander to the emperor. General Roxas survived the war and became the first president of the Republic. In August of 1946, he learned that the man who had saved his life was still a prisoner in northern China, awaiting trial as a war criminal. Roxas wrote a personal letter to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek requesting amnesty for Jimbo. Jimbo was released and he was returned to Japan the following year. After the
At
war,
least that's
General...
something.
Yeah.
At least it's
After-
like repaying that personal honor, right?
Yeah, of course. And do remember, there was two different trials. Technically, there was also one in the Soviet Union, but it's not. It's different. There was, the official Tokyo trial, and then there was another trial that was in China. The one that happened in China, people weren't getting off. I'll say that much. After the war, General Homa would stand trial. He was convicted, and he was executed as a war criminal by the man he had defeated, General Douglas MacArthur. Homa's chief defense counsel, John Skeen, labeled it a highly irregular trial conducted in an atmosphere that left no doubt as to what the ultimate outcome was going to be. Other defense staff signed a letter to Homa stating that he had been unjustly convicted. These are Americans who wrote this. After a war, this is still pretty hot blood territory, so it says a lot that they were willing to put their names on this. Associate Justice Frank Murphy of the U.S. Supreme Court protested the verdict, stating, This nation's very honor, as well as its hope for the future, is at stake. Either we conduct such a trial as this in the noble spirit and atmosphere of our Constitution, or we abandon all pretense to justice, letting the ages slip away and descend to the level of revengeful blood purges. A nation must not perish, because in the natural frenzy of the aftermath of war, it abandoned the central theme of dignity, of the humane personality, and the due process of law. Awaiting his sentence, Homa wrote to his wife, Fujiko, In the 20 years of our married life, we've had many differences of opinion and even violent quarrels. Those quarrels have now become sweet memories. Now as I am about to part from you, I particularly see your good qualities, and I have completely forgotten any defects. I have no worry about leaving the children in your hands, because I know you will raise them to be right and strong. 20 years feels short, but they are long. I'm content that we have lived a happy life together. If there is what is called the other world, we'll be married again. I'll go first and wait for you there, but you mustn't hurry. Live as long as you can for the children and do the things for me I haven't been able to do. You will see our grandchildren and even great-grandchildren and tell me all about them when we meet again in the other world. Thank you very much for everything. Homa then sent a letter to his children just before his execution, and it read like this. There are 6 men here who have been sentenced to life. It will be better to be shot to death, like dying an honorable death on the battlefield, than spending a disgraceful life in such a cage for the rest of one's life. Don't lose courage, children. Don't give in to temptation. Walk straight on the road of justice. The spirit of your father will long watch over you. Your father will be pleased if you make your way in the right direction rather than bring flowers to his grave. Do not miss the right course. This is my very last letter. And so went to General Homa. Here, I'm just going
It's
to
actually
turn
kind of
off my
sad
map.
because
It is very sad. Like I always say, I kind of, not that I'm defending Yamashita, but the Yamashita case, there's more evidence that Yamashita could have been aware of some things in 1945, like especially his treatment of when he was withdrawing in the defense of the Philippines. There's a lot of atrocities there. But in the early days, the Malayan campaign and the Singapore campaign, it's Toiji that did a lot of that. Yamashita, there is clear evidence Yamashita was not aware of what was happening. For Homa, it's like almost straight cut that he did not know. And if you look at his career, you look where he was educated, you look at him as a person, the entire Japanese
that-
command was coming after him.
yeah, just because he was not willing to massacre civilians.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
pretty
think
much,
it's a
that's
blemish.
literally one of.
I think
And
this is a direct blemish on MacArthur, personally, because it was MacArthur who pushed the envelope.
yeah, he said, MacArthur's own quote, right? If this defendant does not deserve his judicial fate, none in jurisdictional history ever did. There can be no greater, more heinous, or more dangerous crime than the mass destruction under guise of military authority or military necessity of helpless men incapable of further contribution to war effort. A failure of law process to punish such acts of criminal enormity would threaten the very fabric of world society. Okay, I get it, but then where was the law in consideration if, anyways, the guy was already decided to be guilty, right? Even General Arthur Trudeau, who was one of the people who was in that 5-man committee that condemned Homa to death, he said he had a pretty high opinion of Homa actually. He did not like the decision. So if I were to just quote General Arthur Trudeau on this, and this is what he said in 71, right? So it's many years after. There's no question but that some men who were either weak or wounded were shot down or bayoneted on this death march. The question is,
Yes.
how many echelons of command up is a person responsible to the point where you should condemn him for murder or crime? And that is what General Homa was accused of. We need to cogitate about our wisdom in condemning General Homa to death. I must admit, I was not much in favor of it. In fact, I was opposed to it, but I could only oppose it to a point that allowed him to be shot as a soldier and not be hanged. I thought he was an outstanding soldier.
Yeah, because when it comes down to it, the most egregious crime is, of course, the Bataan Death March. But I think I explained it into some depth in the last episode. There was plans that were presented to Homa, and like for lack of better words, the plans on paper looked great. It looked like everything was, they had these relief stations, they'd be fed, they'd be watered, they wouldn't have to walk most of it. It was going to be properly done. It was planned for like 15,000 people, ended up being like 75,000 people. And on top of
I
that,
think I was just saying the number of people that were planned for and the actuals was significantly off by factors of multiples, pretty much. I think you mentioned 25,000, but as you said, 75, 80,000 were on the march. They did not really, and most of the officers did not follow the plan. They just did not give a damn. But
of course,
as you did correctly highlight in the previous episode, there were good amount of instances, like still not the majority, but there were instances of Japanese soldiers and officers, right? Just like privates or lieutenants, like, throwing the water carriers to the prisoners so that they can use it. Some officers preventing needless executions, and also the courage of the Filipino citizens who sometimes would try to smuggle away the American soldiers. And I think they mentioned, right, one colonel, instead of blind execution of some prisoners, I think he just let them run into the jungle rather than do it himself and just claim that, oh yeah, they escaped.
because Soichi had a hand to play in this, as well as other nefarious characters. They undermine the efforts, and unlike, there's always a comparison between the Nazi regime and the Japanese. The Nazi regime was men following orders most of the time. Of course, there's just psychopaths doing horrible things, but the Einsatzgruppen and all of them, they're following orders. This is a systematic killing of specific people, like Slavs, the Jews, the Romani, all of them. When it comes to the Japanese atrocities, this is like usually just spur of the moment, hot blooded. Can be grunts, could be officers, are just
I
killing
get where you're
people
going.
needlessly.
I get it because if you even look at it, those who the Nazis considered as the Untermenschen, right, which were like those the Slavs, the Bolsheviks, etc., right, the Jews. I mean, they were hated on from the get-go, and there was a systematic killing. But generally, if you would consider it like those who were not part of these groups, like those who were say in occupied France, the Nordics, the Low Countries. It was not until the war really started to destroy Germany's resources, those territories were relatively better managed and treated by the German authorities then.
Yeah, like you said, until the sabotage really was taking a toll, then they, they make an example, grab a few workers at a plant and start killing them, like even in the Netherlands and stuff, of course. But for the Japanese, who do have an Untermenschen kind of mentality of their own, let's be honest, the co-prosperity sphere, it's like, oh, we're here for Pan-Asianism, but we're the father and you're the children, and you
We're the
need to be
top dogs.
reprimanded and reminded. Yeah, yeah. I mean, especially against the Chinese, like it's insane the level of barbarity they would perform against the Chinese and Indians. The Japanese were notorious for killing Indian POWs. It's
I think
disgusting.
I think only General Reina probably was the only guy that probably liked them, but probably just because he got an extra division, so he was gonna tolerate them during his Impal Kohima offensive.
Yeah, so I do apologize to the audience for taking you handicap at the end to go through the war crimes trial. But I thought it was important because General Homa is a character who it's just like
This deserves to be
Kobayashi,
spoken.
Yamashita. Yeah, it was bad, but I see it from the other side as well. Even take MacArthur out of the equation. Someone had to be put as the scapegoat for the death march. Justice had to be served to those men because you can't put
It does make
50
sense, I guess.
officers up there. It didn't make sense.
True, and I guess at the same time, where the defense for Homa, which I think we might be slightly in favor, is not at an institutional level. It is for the individual in question.
Yeah. It's hard to put a war crimes trial on, for these instances, especially for the Bataan Death March, because who do you blame? It's thousands of grunts. It's all these minor, low-ranking, and young officers. We're talking like 22-year-old officers doing this.
They're probably, most of them are dead by now.
Yeah,
by the
they're
time
all
of
over
the
the
trials.
place. Yeah, a lot of them are in Manchuria, expelled. Anyways, yeah, but it made sense that they had to put a face on it, and yeah, of course it's gonna be Homa. Unfortunately, and his demise is a sad one. I have to note, when you read American books on the subject matter, usually American books, I mean, I'm talking like the ones that came out in the 70s, 80s, and such, are not lenient against these Japanese figures. But when it comes to Yamashita and Homa, they do kind of sympathize with what happened. So it's it's there. But that finishes off this series. I'm going to be fully making this a sort of documentary. It'll be on the YouTube channel. I'm going to clean it up a little bit, make it less podcasty, do a little bit more animation work, because as Karov noted, I put up a map for Corregidor that was the 45 map, but it was more detailed, so maybe I can fix that up so it looks a little better. And before I let everybody off, again, if you'd like to support this channel, please consider checking out the YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/The Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is 36 episodes and ongoing at this point. You get early access to all the content I make. I have a episode that's going to be coming out on the Patreon soon for early access. Me looking at, it's a kind of a part 2, how anime depicts the Pacific War, and a lot of very interesting animes I found from the 1970s.
Can I
Be a
just
fun one.
add that some of these animes from the 70s and 80s, they're quite deep.
Oh, the 1970s was just a different time, and it's pretty blunt. I'm surprised by how the Japanese kind of portray some stuff. They don't talk about, the war crimes, of course, but it's interesting, some of the stuff.
It's actually like, okay, I think it'll be out of scope because I was just talking about a science fiction franchise for the depiction of war.
Yeah. And of course, lastly, I have polls on the YouTube membership and the Patreon account for the stuff that I'll be tackling next. And it doesn't have to be Pacific War related. I do all sorts of history and outside of history. I'll do sci-fi or fantasy. If anybody will ever let me do something about the Alien franchise, I finished my 20th book on Audible yesterday. And anyways, long story short, I read something called The Rage Wars, which is a Alien versus Predator trilogy. And it is I am shocked. The author wrote some Star Wars novels and other things. This guy is a really good writer, and I really want to do an episode on it, but it's
the X-Wing series author. Because coincidentally, I'm listening to on Audible right now the X-Wing series by Mark Thompson.
Yeah, nice.
It's a pretty good series.
So yeah, stating that if anybody ever wants to hear me go on about the alien world and how that works, because I have such extensive knowledge. But anyways, I pitched it to Wizards and Warriors, and they won't let me do it. But there might be some other series coming on Wizards and Warriors that's going to be by me. Here, I'll just tease it now. Extensive look into StarCraft and the wars and the lore of StarCraft. That'll be interesting. But stating all of that, this has been the Pacific War. This has been Echoes of War. Force of Habit there. Over and out.